Chapter 8. As Charles left the hospital a few days later after a late duty, he realized that he had hardly been aware of his work there all evening. He had done all that was necessary, but his mind had been set on Mary. He crossed the car park and got into his car. Tuning the radio, he decided to listen to the news at 10, that might just take his mind off Mary and the problems she posed for a while at least. The voice blurted in on the silence, and here are our sayings for tonight, sent in by a loyal listener from Central Accra. The first one is, if you do not take chances you will forever stay where you are, and the second goes like this, save life no matter the method. Charles sighed. Everything seemed to bring him back to thoughts of Mary and his search for a cure. It is the only way, he muttered fiercely to himself as he bit deeply into his lower lip. He started the car and set off down Bank Lane. Bitten with the bug of urgency, he changed gears like a madman operating a crane. 400 yards down the road he stopped to fill the tank with petrol and to top up the oil. He gave the pump attendant a 50 cedi note and forgot to wait for the change. Within 3 minutes of starting off again, he had passed the University of Ghana and was soon out of town. He began to ascend into the dangerous Aburi Hills, 18 miles outside Accra. As the car reached the crest of a hill, Charles could see the taillight of a lone car a couple of miles on down the hill. His attention seemed to be drawn by the taillight until he found himself obsessed with the idea of catching up with the car. After turning a sharp bend, he realized too late that there was a barricade in front of the Pedways Lodge, the presidential retreat palace. He rammed on the brakes but could not avoid skidding into it and stopping a few yards away. Immediately the police and army personnel rushed towards the car with guns tilted at the ready. "Who the hell are you?" a gruff voice demanded. "Dr. Charles Sego. I'm on my way to Aburi Hospital, it's an emergency call. I do apologize about the barrier, I just didn't see it in time." Charles bent the truth and tossed the gruff voice his identity card. Having inspected it, and appearing to be satisfied with what he saw, the soldier saluted and asked his patrol to check the extent of any damage to the car. A Datsun 260C, Charles knew, was far too strong to be harmed by a flimsy bar pitched on top of 2 wine barrels. "Nothing damaged, sir," came the answer. As Charles waved goodbye with one hand, he maneuvered the car into the correct lane with the other and zoomed away. The gruff voice wishing him a safe journey was lost in the roar of the engine. For no real reason, Charles had not forgotten that disappearing taillight, and within 5 minutes he had caught up with the car once more. He moved out to overtake the car and as he did so, glanced across at its occupant. Charles could tell by his uniform that he was an army captain. He had probably just finished his duty spell at the Pedways Lodge, Charles thought. As these thoughts passed through his mind, the captain's car braked suddenly, causing Charles to skid swerving to a halt. Charles burst angrily out of his car towards the captain. As he neared the car he saw, in a split second, the captain pull out 2 objects from the glove compartment in front of the passenger seat. He had just reached the car when a strong torchlight was flashed in his face, making him angrier still. He was about to explode with complaints when he was brought up short by the barrel of a pistol a couple of feet away, pointing straight in his direction. "Hands on your head," the captain demanded curtly. Charles obeyed. "Move backwards," he ordered, and followed Charles closely. He flashed the light of the torch into Charles' car as if to make sure that he was a lone robber. "You have been following me. What do you want?" he barked. "Just some information," Charles replied as calmly as possible. This time he realized it might not be so easy to bluff his way out of an awkward situation. The captain was also alone and might get carried away with feelings of power and importance. What information? Charles himself was unsure why he had followed the car. He knew he could not give a plausible explanation if he attempted the truth. His mind rapidly debated between the shrine and the hospital, and as he had all the credentials for it, he opted for the latter. "I wanted to know the exact location of the Latte Hospital." "Who exactly are you, then?" "I want the truth. I am Dr. Charles Sego of Kalbu, out on an emergency call," he added quickly, and for the second time that night. The captain was used to such robbers. They always had cosmetic stories when their criminal attempts failed. He backed at Charles once again. Stretch your arms sideways, higher. Charles did as he asked. Suddenly and without warning he felt a blinding flash of pain in his stomach, and then nothingness. Grinning sadistically, the captain dragged Charles to the Datsun and dumped him in the back seat. Leaving an inch or so of airspace at the top of one of the windows, he drove away in his own car, congratulating himself on his efficient method of dealing with such scum. Professor Eastman glanced across at his snoring wife and smiled affectionately. All the anger had left her, and she slept peacefully, like a child. He walked softly across to the wardrobe, opened the door and took out a pamphlet from his overcoat pocket. Without looking at it, he transferred it to his jacket pocket. Careful not to disturb his wife, he walked out of the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. Down in the study, he knelt by his desk and prayed consciously for the first time in his adult life. Dear God, I pray that you may guide and direct me safely to the end. Amen. He got up to sit on the chair in front of the desk and took the pamphlet out of his pocket. He had not studied it before. Now he stared closely at the cover as Father Oaken had instructed. It read, How to Behave and Participate in Magic as a Neophyte. The words were set in the center of the Star of David, in letters of burning candles. He gazed intently at the center of the star as he had been instructed. His mind began to recede into emptiness. Then he turned to the first page. There was only one sentence printed there, and it read, Fear not, you and God are one. As he had been told, he began to gaze at the center of the cross set beneath the words. After 3 minutes he turned to the second page. It contained instructions for a fundamental chant to soothe the nerves, lower the heartbeat, reduce breathing to a minimum and deter excitement. After another 3 minutes he turned to the next page and followed the instructions there for a superior breathing exercise. He began to feel that he was actually breathing through his toenails, the skin of his feet, then his bones and finally his nerves. At this point it seemed to him as if he had totally vacated his physical body. Soon he felt as if he was one with an all-consuming light, and finally he felt nothing at all. This was the first of a series of such sequences performed by Professor Eastman in preparation for the rite of exorcism in which he was to take part. Draw thou a circle of white, that which has no beginning and no end. Inside this draw the sacred triangle, the sign of perfection at the points of which thou shalt place 3 candles. Salute in honesty the East, the source of all wisdom, and light the eastern candle. Next, light the other 2, for unto light was added light. 3 auras shalt thou see in all their glory. Now enter into the very center with a glass of water. Set the glass down between your feet and pray thou as follows. I, servant of the Lord, solemnly pledge my unflinching service to the Lord and request that the masters of the white light be released to provide the very vibrations that create the life force. Father Oaken stepped out from the center of the triangle and solemnly encircled it with a line drawn in the sand with a stick. Little Peter, with the crucifix in his right hand, lit the candle on his left, turned his face away from the east and then responded. Now the gates of glorious, good are opened. Come nigh, Master of the 3 corners. He planted his candle and then the crucifix into the sand. Before them were the receding waves of the Gulf of Guinea. Behind them the Romanesque architecture of Black Star Square. For no apparent reason so late at night, its numerous floodlights had not yet been turned on. Far in the east the powerful lights of OSU Castle threw their rays onto the sea, and to the west lay a dark, deserted stretch of beach. Father Oaken walked slowly around the outline prepared in the sand, then nodded to Peter, who once again began to recite the necessary prayers and incantations with the utmost involvement. Almost 15 minutes passed before he entered the center of the encircled triangle. He stared into the glass of water on the sand and then slowly announced, She is here. Professor Eastman had been told that gradually he would sink into purer and finer levels of thought and finally into apparent thoughtlessness. One such mental exercise a night would eventually tune him up for the crucial event. He had begun the exercises as a skeptic, but now, as he slowly emerged from a state of nothingness to reality, two thoughts alternated in his mind. In the first place, never before had he experienced such total and redeeming rest of both mind and body. Secondly, his thoughts were carried away by the remembrance of events concerning his twin daughters. For almost 2 years the girls, Aquili and Ekiwaka, had constantly and alternately been ill. What was a mystery was the fact that as soon as Aquili was cured, for example from the pains in her left foot, Ekiwaka took them on in the same spot. And if Ekiwaka had a sore stomach for 3 days, Aquili would start the following week for 3 days. Professor Eastman admitted that neither he nor his medical colleagues could find the solution to the twins' peculiar plight. Finally, his wife had dropped a hint that there was a ritual which should be performed for all twins in the Accra traditional area, and that failure to do so usually resulted in a lifetime of unexplained affliction for both twins. He could not believe that a doctor's wife could talk such nonsense. But eventually, at his wife's prompting, the elders of the clan approached him, and, with misgivings, he allowed Awofio Wonse, the fetish priestess of the clan, to carry out what to him was a primitive and anachronistic ritual. On a cold Friday morning, Friday being the twins of Accra's day, the elders and Awofio Wonse arrived and, according to custom, took the toddlers away to the priestess' house a couple of kilometers away. Professor Eastman allowed his wife to join the ungodly group, but he would have nothing to do with it himself. He even swore that if his children caught pneumonia, he would make sure that the law caught the elders and the priestess alike. At 6 o'clock the twins were returned, not alone, but with what he regarded as a few juju items sent to bend his Christian principles. In an empty milk carton, there were 2 cows' horns smeared over with some white matter and lying on a sickly-smelling herb. 2 eggs and a few copper coins of the Gold Coast era completed the salvation items. The priestess' instructions were that each morning the twins were to be bathed in a portion of the stinking herb, and the horns and coins were to be rubbed over them afterwards for 7 days consecutively. By the 7th day the twins were well and happy and beginning to play more than ever before. Suddenly there was neither sickness nor illness. On that first Friday, after the unholy ritual had taken place, the professor had suffered a dilemma: was he to pray to his Christian God or to the new and miraculous fetish god? By way of a compromise, he had prayed to his Christian God and also poured libation to the ancestors. When he awoke in the morning and found the twins already playing in their cots, the 2-year-old tension and stress seemed to have vanished completely. His old boyishness returned, and for once he began to entertain, albeit in secret, some respect for fetishism. Since that time, he had always hoped for further signs to guide him, and now, after all this time, he was experiencing something similar all over again, only this time it could be a launching pad for God knew what. Professor Eastman opened his eyes. The light of his lamp, though soft and low, made him blink, and he raised his hand to shade his eyes. As they grew accustomed to the light, he was able to turn to the last page of the pamphlet and read the last words printed there. They posed a question. "Are you prepared?" The question lingered on in his mind for a time. Then, in a low voice he muttered, "Yes." The prophets and pains of the word always hit Bishop Quarcoopome mysteriously. He often considered the circumstances under which he had married Zandria, the mystery baby they had adopted, and even his chosen profession. Now the mysterious cure for his daughter was uppermost in his mind. He smothered a cough as the smoke from the incense started to choke him, but he kept his eye on the small, makeshift altar he had erected. He was a man of stature and discipline. He had acquired wisdom from the practical side of theology and divinity, but felt he had learnt more from the occasions when he had participated in acts of mysticism. The thoughts of his fortunes and misfortunes seized his mind briefly, but he soon dismissed them when the gold cross on the altar began to gleam. In divinity this was the green light, the go-ahead message he had been waiting for. "Amen," he mumbled softly. Raising his eyes to heaven he followed the word of submission with the sign of the cross and rose up from his kneeling position. As he began to pack his accoutrements away, his mind wandered back to his first public mystical ritual as a student priest. He had been conducting a service of Holy Communion, and as he had gone through the ritual, chanting softly with the response coming from the supervising priest, fellow students and visiting parish priests, an indescribable feeling or sensation had taken hold of him. At one point he had almost broken down. The organ boomed, the voices were alien and sweet, the candles glittered, the robed students did not appear to belong to this earth, let alone his divinity class, and try as he might, he could not make out a single face that he recognized. But he carried on. He had performed the same crucial exercise in preparation for this day at least every other day for 3 months with total ease. This was not the time for failure. When the ordeal finally ended, everyone swarmed around him, hugging and congratulating him. The report on the notice board had read, chanting, 80, giving of bread and wine, 100, secret signals and eye movements, 80, prayer recitation, 100, timing -85, gestures, 100, signals to the congregation, 90. But all that was long ago, and those rituals had become a part of himself. He had approached ritual after ritual as a bishop with professional ease and commitment. Tonight, it had been hard work, but also profitable. With a feeling of self-satisfaction, he put the last candlestick away and retired wearily to bed. A car slowed down close by Mrs. Quarcoopome and the occupant leant out and shouted to her, "Old prostitute, go home." Without turning, and showing no signs of having heard him, she kept going straight ahead. Crossing over to the right of the wide high street, she began walking along the pavement in front of the Shell head offices. The car pursued her, and as it drew up alongside her once again, a youthful voice asked, "Want a lift?" "No thank you. How much will it be?" "For what?" "For the night." She began to move away, trying to repress the feelings of horror and disgust which immediately welled up inside her and threatened to engulf her completely. "Will 10 cedis be okay?" the young man persisted. "Half the night is already burnt. I may be your last customer. Think fast." The bishop's wife wished she had the strength to open the car door and slap the foolish youth in the face, spit fire and pepper in his eyes and throw him straight into hellfire. What impudence from the brazen little monster. "I live in the airport residential area," he continued, oblivious of the effect his advances were having upon her. "My father is attending a conference in London. We will have a 7-bedroomed house all to ourselves, and a host of servants at our service." Mrs. Quarcoopome realized that the boy was slightly drunk and would continue to be persistent. She stopped walking, faced the boy, took off her sunglasses and backed out at him. "My dear little son, I am your father's age, and if you were a child of mine and behaved in this shameful manner, I should instantly call the police. Even right now, if you do continue to pester me, I shall not hesitate to give your registration number to the next patrolman I meet. If you don't want any misfortunes in your father's absence, go home, say your prayers and sleep like a good boy." She turned and began to walk purposefully away. For blocks on she turned to look back. The little drunk was still sitting behind the wheel. As she resumed her walk, she began to muse on this new breed of the younger generation from his background. Their parents owned posh houses in salubrious areas. They usually had 3 or more cars, but despite this obvious wealth, were often hours a day absent from their homes grasping for more. Left to their own devices at a crucial stage in their lives, their children became delinquent teenagers and had to be bailed out of trouble by their parents, either by using the weight of their superior positions in public life, or else by lavishly greasing the palms of the law enforcement officers. Shaking her head sadly at these thoughts, Mrs. Quarcoopome branched off into the narrow Asia lane. It was a place of filth and squalor. Although the vicinity was small, it was a sovereign republic in its own right. During the day, the fisherfolk dried their smelly nets in the lane, while their wives sat gutting the fish around them. Neither the police nor the army had ever succeeded in clearing the streets for vehicular use. At night, the people sold their smuggled goods from Togo and the Ivory Coast, as well as their bodies and marijuana. Mrs. Quarcoopome was aware that the people around her eyed her with hostile suspicion, but she continued to walk on. Again, she branched left into a back alley with a dark and stony path. 3 times she stumbled, 3 times she steadied herself against the dirty walls, and 3 times she prayed to God to stay her panic. Then, looking up, she saw the lighted end of a cigarette a couple of meters away. She stopped in her tracks as a thick voice reached her ears. "Where are you going, love?" What is it to you? Zandria replied with a show of false bravado, barely managing to disguise the fear rising within her. You know quite well. I don't know what you are talking about, she replied coldly. We come from Lagos. That must attract you, eh? Suddenly the realization dawned that she was in the center of a circle of 5 or 6 tough men. One asked curtly, Who are you? What is your business here? I have just been told my mother is seriously ill, and I want to go and see her. She allowed some of the panic she actually felt to flood into her voice to add weight to the lie she had just told. Go quickly, one of the men relented, but don't pass this way again. Yes, sir, she replied gratefully and moved away as rapidly as the uneven path would allow. The alley ended behind the motorway. She lingered a while as a series of thoughts played in her mind. All I need from this place is the hidden dossier on my daughter. And maybe to learn if there is a possibility of any healing method for her here, or anywhere. But the thought of a bishop's daughter having to be healed here is ghastly. The events of Mary's short life passed like a film through her mind and, as she witnessed once again the horrific events of the past weeks, she became fully and finally convinced that her husband was right. Mary was no longer a purely psychiatric case. She was indeed an enigma and could be cured only mysteriously, perhaps only by the fetish folk themselves. If only they could be trusted to keep their mouths shut. Finally convinced that the only cure now lay in the hands of Mary's fetish clan at Montsewi, Mrs. Quarcoopome decided she would be wrong to act alone as she had originally planned. First, she must talk her husband Ishmael into the deal, despite his commitment to the rite of exorcism, before she talked to any of the fetish people. Satisfied with these decisions, she moved on to the western end of Selwa Market Street, crossed over to the left side of the high street and began walking briskly along the pavement by the old State Publishing Corporation buildings. She glanced casually into the empty offices of the Afromedia advertising offices as she passed by. At the end of that pavement, she stopped. She had come to the most dangerous place for her, for she could quite easily have been spotted here. It was the large, empty, open car park of the Guardian Royal Exchange Insurance offices, which shared a common low wall with the parish priest living quarters, and the floodlights of the car park were blazing out. She crossed to the other side of the street where the lights were much dimmer, hurriedly walked up to the Barclays Bank building and made a dash for the large and imposing gates of the Trinity Cathedral grounds. They were locked. The self-imposed calm she had managed to command all evening deserted her, and with a stone she rapped frantically on the metal gates. As the watchman approached, she took off her sunglasses once more. He could not help showing his surprise on recognizing her, but he quickly recollected himself, saluted and opened the gates. Quietly she slipped in, sighing softly with relief. She could feel the eyes of the watchman boring into her back as her dim figure receded into the shadows. Eventually she was home, and as she mounted the stairs after locking the front door, the sing-song lapping of the waves came full and strong to her ears, a soothing music after the rigors of the fraught evening. Home, sweet home, she thought, and her courage and strength slowly flowed back. Smiling serenely, she switched on the bedroom light, careful to check first that the door to her husband's room was closed, and there by the window, quite quiet, watching the stars and the sea, was her husband, Ishmael. The wind was still, the waves were ebbing, and it was becoming colder. Little Peter sank his hands deep into his cassock pockets and drew the gown tightly around himself. He gazed intently into the glass of water and, for the second time, announced, "She is here." The priest sprinkled holy water to the 3 corners of the triangle and then nodded to Peter, who returned his gaze to the glass of water and whispered a question. He nodded mysteriously in some sort of silent agreement and turned his attention once more to Father Oaken, who carried the crucifix to each of the 3 corners of the triangle and returned to his place in the east. He nodded solemnly to Peter, who again turned to the glass of water. His face showed worry and sadness as he shook his head negatively at Father Oaken. Time was running out. The question must be answered by 12 midnight. Peter walked to the edge of the circle and whispered to the priest, "She wishes for a rapid cure, but the masters have not yet come. There's nobody else in the glass." Without waiting for a reply, he walked back to his position in the center of the triangle. He had been instructed that nothing must come from outside the circle. Just before midnight, his drowsy eyes became once more alert. The cold winds began to blow more strongly, there were flashes of light in the sky, and then a total stillness fell all around. Peter kept his gaze on the glass, and slowly began to smile. He walked confidently to the edge of the circle. "Father," he whispered, "we have an answer." He came and gave his approval, he agreed. Father Oken entered the triangle with triumph on his face. He offered thanks to God and began the mystical ritual of communication with the Master. Every now and then he signaled to Peter, who moved swiftly about, taking and replacing mystical objects as requested, joining in a chant here and responding to a prayer there. At 1:02, with all their accoutrements packed away in the old black leather bag, the tall dark figure of Father Oken, and the slight but equally dark one of Peter, began to climb the steps to Marine Drive. Just as they reached the top, a car blinked its headlights twice and came to a halt beside them. They climbed in gratefully and it sped away. Nearly half an hour had elapsed before the body, slumped unceremoniously in the back seat of the Datsun 260C, began to stretch. Charles felt shooting pains in his sides and chest and a sickening throbbing in his head. He tried to turn over, but found the exertion very painful, and, as the dull smell of leather hit him, his mind began to wander. He could not remember exactly what had happened or even where he was. With a great effort he dragged himself up into a sitting position, stretched his hand forward and touched the front seat. Slowly he realized that he was in the back seat of a car. He switched the roof light on. It was the 260C he had been driving for the past week. He struggled to recall what had happened, how he had come to be there. Sketchy glimpses of memory flitted in and out of his head, until finally he could remember the encounter with the army captain. He stared at the clock on the dashboard, it was 11:05 p.m. He stretched his weary body again, wincing at the pain the action produced, and climbed over into the driver's seat. He found his car key in his breast pocket and turned it in the ignition. The engine responded readily, bursting into life. He tested the gears, they appeared to be all right. With relief he turned on the headlights and began to move forwards. At least it seemed that the captain had not chosen to sabotage his car as well as his body. Fumbling with the radio knob, he found station 2 of Radio Ghana. It was playing the national anthem, the last item of the day. 2 minutes later he saw the reflective notice reading "Welcome to Aburi." It was only then that he remembered his mission to the Akanidi shrine at Late, some 20 more miles ahead. He remembered the present Akanidi vividly, for he had known her before she had taken on the ancient title of the supreme fetish priest of the Aquapim Late area. Several years ago, this particular Akanidi had been a brilliant girl, 2 years his senior at medical school. Although he had lived in Commonwealth Hall and she in Aknafo Hall, they had met frequently and had become close friends and colleagues. Both had collected prizes in neurology whilst students, both had written highly commended essays on the central nervous system, both had researched into brain wave patterns and their effects on the body. When Charles had left university to take up a post he had been offered in the prestigious Ghana Medical Association, he and the Akanidi, then known as Adobia Akrifi, had remained friends by writing to each other fairly regularly, but Charles had been stunned by the news on the front page of the mass circulation daily graphic that the Secretary General of the GMA, Mama Adobia Akrifi, had resigned and was awaiting the call of the gods to service. The new Akanidi had become an instant success, and Charles remembered that her special field had been medically incurable mental cases. Headlines referring to her success in such cases had frequently bombarded the front pages and the radio news. She had also become something of a television star, as she was prepared to state her beliefs as often as there were people to listen to her. She argued that the brain is only a system in which the mind, abstract, fleeting, yet ever-present, finds its expression. Further, she believed that the fleeting mind has connections with the unknown, or mysticism. She felt that there was a power in man which could free him from the physical limitations of time and space. This elusive, untapped inner power was, according to her, the key to the meaning of life. An approaching car dimmed its headlights and Charles followed suit. As the cars passed, the light illuminated two objects by the roadside. The first was a milestone which indicated 5 miles more to Latte. The second was a sign of welcome to Manfuro Clinic. Charles stopped to ask the watchman for the keys in order to obtain some painkillers to soothe the pulsing pain in his head, displaying his identity card, but it proved a fruitless effort. He returned to the car and slowly drove off. Almost as a ritual now, he very often studied the cards containing Mary's medical history and the attached research report about the paranoid state in general. He decided to revise it all briefly before seeing his old friend the Aconidi, whom he trusted would see him at any time. Setting the cards on the dashboard in front of him, he glanced at them now and again, keeping the main part of his attention on the road. The cards reminded him that the term paranoid, originally Greek, had simply meant insanity until the 18th century, when it had come to mean more specifically delusional psychosis, with the delusion developing slowly into a complex hallucination and general personal disorganization. The latter description fitted Mary well. The fixed delusion, he read, may be grandiose, persecutory, or erotic. Mary's was persecutory. Today psychiatry has reserved the term paranoia strictly for the sudden arrival of chronic paranoid states. Mary's was certainly sudden, and it was becoming chronic. There are 3 types of paranoid persons, namely the tense, insecure, or suspicious types. By family traits, Mary fitted into the tense category, but was quickly developing insecurity as well, as treatment failed time after time. 2 further features of paranoia are the tendencies towards secrecy and talkativeness. Mary had only one truly close friend, himself, in whom she did not always confide seriously. At school and at home, before she had met Charles, all her friendships had been strictly platonic, and she had become more secretive, eventually refusing to see even Shoma at all. She did not, Charles decided, fit into the last category as she was not over-talkative. The hospital test results had shown her to be a typical paranoid. Mary had built up tension in and around herself, no longer trusted anybody except Charles, and not always him, consistently referred to herself in conversation, always attempted to scrutinize closely the statements or actions of others, and to see them as being hostile to herself, and was hypersensitive. Her fears, wishes, guilt, weaknesses, and frustrations had become greatly amplified in her mind. For example, recently she would neither talk about nor read the Bible, out of guilt and fear. The research conclusions, as to the areas which should be treated, had been twofold. The first was the factor of recurrent temptation in Mary's case to commit, or fantasize about, some forbidden hostile action which might possibly take its source from primitive impulses. The second was the frustration which always arose out of guilt after the performance of the act. For this known category into which Mary fell, Carlsbad Hospital had had a remarkable 80% clinical therapy success. The method used had been the reduction of anxiety and the establishment of genuine communication. Charles, and to a lesser extent Professor Eastman, had become Mary's tools of total confidence. It had not often been necessary to use drugs since Mary had generally at that time been normal all 7 days of the week, except for the 3 minutes between 2:20 and 2:23 p.m. on Sundays. Throughout the week the neurotransmitters they had used with Mary had worked perfectly. All too mysteriously, the machine monitoring her brain wave pattern had failed to work between these times on Sundays. In medical terms, this just could not be explained. Another car passed, dipping its headlights, and jolted Charles' concentration away from the medical reports. Soon after, he saw the sign welcoming travelers to Latte, and noted that the dashboard clock read 11:29 p.m. He found the petrol station attendant sleeping and woke him up to get some rather jumbo directions to the Aconidi clinic. Having pushed a 2-cedi note into his informant's hand, he drove away. The clinic, though built along the same lines, was considerably smaller than the Carlsbad complex. Charles parked the Datsun 260C and strode to the reception area where a nurse behind the desk attended to him almost immediately. "Good evening, sir, can I help you?" "I'd be glad if you can. I would like to see the Aconidi, please." "Do you have an appointment?" the nurse asked politely. "No, but I am sure she will see me." I am so sorry. The nurse looked and sounded genuine enough. It is only possible to see her by appointment. She is so very busy, you see. She has 2 more patients to see even now, one in the lab and the other in the shrine, and the clinic closes at midnight. Would you like to see her assistant, doctor? No, Charles cut in impatiently. She has asked me to come. Now, young lady, just let her know that Dr. Nana Sego of Kalbu has come from Accra on urgent business. Thank you. All the way from Accra. Sorry, sir. Please take a seat and I'll let her know. Charles sat wearily in a comfy-looking chair, chose a magazine about herbal foods and drugs from a selection on a nearby table, and was soon absorbed in reading it. A few minutes later the nurse returned and handed Charles a note. It read, "What a marvelous surprise. To think that you were on my mind only this evening. We'll see you in about half an hour. Go steady on some of my herbal tea, good for blood and brain. Adobia." Charles smiled and relaxed. By the time the 3rd cup of whatever tea he had been drinking had arrived, the effects were obvious. He was in a pleasant state of restful ease, but also felt quite alert. As he glanced up to the clock, chiming the midnight hour, he noticed a small side door opening, and the Akanidi entered with the same full smile across her face that he remembered so affectionately and so well. Mary rose from the bed and switched on the bedside lamp. She had been asleep for only 2 hours. Suddenly she felt hollow inside, and hungry. She crossed the room to the switch on the opposite wall and lit the brighter ceiling light. On her way down to the kitchen, having tiptoed as quietly as possible past her nurse's bedroom, she passed Charles' room. She wished he was at home. He would have talked her out of her melancholy. She thought of all he was doing for her and smiled affectionately, remembering their latest trip into the country together. Forgetting now that she had felt hungry, Mary's thoughts turned to the medical records which Charles and his colleagues kept about her and her attacks. The thought grew until the idea of finding the records became an obsession. But half an hour searching in all the likely places did not bring forth any fruit. Mary felt lost and alone. The loneliness gripped her as never before, and she switched on the tape recorder for some company. Finding herself unable to appreciate the music as she usually did, she went to the phone and dialed her parents' number, but after only 2 rings at the other end, she rang off. They can no longer be trusted, she muttered bitterly to herself. She wandered into the lounge to look for an interesting magazine to while away the time, and found the girls' high school fortnightly. It brought her thoughts abruptly back to school. Charles had arranged for her to take her exams at home, but now there was the impending handing over ceremony which traditionally took place on a Sunday after lunch, and that was just 2 weeks away. 2 weeks after that there would be the A-level results, and if hers were good enough, she would be off to the medical school at the University of Ghana. Her thoughts raced along, powered by her ambitions to do well. She knew that she was too bright to fail her exams. Indeed, failure had never been a part of her life. She had always done things and done them well, or not attempted them at all. Such extravagant thoughts of future events made Mary feel hungry again, and she marched off to the kitchen where she prepared a late-night feast of banku and okra stew. Having finished her meal, she returned upstairs to her bedroom and, as she still felt wide awake, began to tidy her belongings. When she came to the dressing table she stopped suddenly, having caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked more closely. It was not flattering. She realized that she had lost weight and become rather bony. Her eyes were dull and slightly bloodshot, her forehead was becoming lined, her nose flatter, her hair, which had not been as carefully attended to of late as it should have been, had lost its shine. When she smiled in an attempt to recover her old attractiveness, she saw only what to her was an ugly face. Horrified at the realization of the physical as well as the mental change in herself, she broke down in tears. When she stopped to dry her eyes, her thoughts were bitter ones. What she had always refused to admit, and yet now at her lowest ebb, came to believe strongly, was that she really was quite mad. The brilliant girls' high school prefect was quite mad. Even her intended profession, medicine, had completely failed to cure her. She felt like a lone wreck without friends or sympathizers. Apart from Charles, everybody seemed to her to be an enemy, forever wanting to investigate her innermost being. How do you feel today, Mary? Have you had an attack? Have you eaten anything? How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel? The stream of questions was endless. For Mary, Charles stood miles apart from all the others. Even during his 30-minute morning tea break, he would dash home to see her. When he was on early duty at the hospital, he finished at 2 and was home by 10 past. They would listen to music together, watch television together, play or wear together, eat together, wash plates and pots and pans together and go out together. The subject of her mental instability was never raised by Charles unless she herself wanted to talk about it, and it was he alone who could make her feel normal. But, thought Mary bitterly, what use was one's trust in a single good man when the whole of the rest of the world was against you? A story she had heard during her Form 5 days at school ran its entire course in her mind. In a small village called Yalley, about 100 people lived happily, putting into practice the belief that every man is his brother's keeper. It was common news when a person had even a slight cold, and every villager would pay the sufferer a visit. Everybody saw everybody else every day. The village had its fair share of the good things of nature, and the community had one priest whose mere touch, it was said, brought indescribable relief to those in pain. This same priest was known as the village encyclopedia. His announcements as to when the harmattan would arrive, or when the trade winds would come with their abundant rains, had never failed in their accuracy. Yalley also had one madman, whose character appeared to be a mixture of good and evil, each trait coming to the fore separately. As nature would have it, the priest, early one Sunday, decided to bathe in the shallow Denso River. The naked priest spent a long time in the cool, clear water and left reluctantly but rather hurriedly to go and officiate at the High Massachusetts. To his surprise, his clothes had vanished. Then, behind a low bush, he spied Yalley's madman laughing loudly at him, and tauntingly holding up his clothes. After 15 minutes of attempted persuasion, the priest decided to apply force and attacked the madman physically. But the madman got away and began running towards the village. In his blind fury, the priest forgot that he was naked and took chase. Unfortunately, nearly all the villagers were out in the village on their way to church. To see their saintly and highly revered priest naked and chasing after the village madman was quite unbelievable. Was he also mad? They asked. What had he been doing, naked, at the shallow river? What was he doing with the village madman? Why should he give his clothes to a madman? Of course, nobody thought that he had simply gone to bathe because nobody had ever known him to do it before. The village priest was therefore proclaimed mad by the verdict of the majority, and no one listened to his attempts at an explanation. The priest had eventually given up the chase and dashed past a crowd of giggling children, frowning fathers and horrified mothers into his priestly abode. A while later, a group of elders arrived at his house demanding an explanation of the recent spectacle they had witnessed. The more the priest shouted, "I am not mad at them," the more they were convinced that he really was mad. The struggling priest had been bound hand and foot and driven to a mental hospital in Accra. And that, thought Mary, was her own dilemma. Who declared who mad, and how did you convince them otherwise when they were convinced of your insanity? With such thoughts in her head, Mary became frantic. If the rite of exorcism, like all the medical treatment before, failed, then she also would probably be left to wither slowly in a mental institution as an incurable maniac. She had heard of 30-year-olds who had spent their entire lives in such institutions. In a complete panic now, she galloped upstairs to the bathroom and pulled open the medicine cabinet door. It was locked. She rushed blindly back to the kitchen and returned with an empty Fanta bottle which she held at the cabinet with all her strength. Through the broken door, she took out the jar which contained her tranquilizers, but to add to her frustration, there were only 2 left. The other pills there were painkillers, antibiotics and so on. An overdose of these things would not kill, would not release her from the prospect of a useless life. Determined not to be outdone, she rushed to the kitchen and searched frantically in terror for the sharp carving knife. It was right in front of her, but pure fury blinded her. "I will not go to a mental hospital," she shouted at nobody as she dashed to her bedroom and searched everywhere for some little tool to put her out of her misery. But there was no life-ending weapon. In a frenzy of frustration, she wrenched the plug of the bedside lamp from its socket and pushed her fingers into the 3 square holes. Despite her expectations, there was not even the slightest shock. "Bastards!" she screamed and broke down on the bed in total exhaustion and disappointment as her nurse rushed in, rubbing her sleepy eyes, to see what all the noise was about. "Zandria, where have you come from?" her husband asked her, still staring thoughtfully out of the window. She stood stock still with surprise in the doorway, not knowing how to, nor really wanting to answer. Seconds later, when she had overcome the shock her husband had given her, she turned without speaking and noiselessly closing the door behind her, she began to undress. Disturbed by his wife's silence and her unusual lack of frank communication, Father Quarcoopome turned from the window to find his wife ready for bed, applying cream to her face in front of the dressing table. Sensing his glance, she paused to look up at him, then smiling sadly as if in apology for her silence, she walked over to him and put her arms around him. They stood in each other's embrace for some time, but neither of them spoke, and it was as if an understanding grew between them through the physical contact rather than through words. Eventually Zandria withdrew herself from his arms, kissed her husband on the forehead, left him and went to bed. The Akanidi, Adobia Acrifi, did not appear to breathe like ordinary mortals. Her breathing was slow, low, and so full it seemed to fill her lungs, muscles, and even the tiny nerves in every fiber of her body. She did not blink as she read the report in front of her. Her only movement was made in order to turn to the next page. She looked completely relaxed, and yet a strong magnetism seemed to emanate from her, creating an indefinable aura about her person, which somehow suggested a certain knowledge about the very source of human life itself. There was nothing artificial about her. Her hair was plaited in the traditional and conventional Anego style, and she wore a simple green blouse under her doctor's white cotton jacket. A single telephone was the only modern convenience on the well-polished supple desk. The walls of the room were covered with high bookshelves, well stocked with books and journals as if the room were a library or a museum. There were books about Okan beliefs, worship of the deities, Ashanti herbal laws, and the secret codes of the worship of the gods of Latte. There was even a book about practices of juju in the Benin Republic, whilst on another shelf there appeared the complete works of Shakespeare and several volumes of Greek mythology. In the far corner of the room there was a small green flowerless plant which emitted a sweet fragrance that gently pervaded the room. Smooth black and white pebbles lay in a glass bowl on the desk, and by them a split kola nut and a palm nut lay like twins in a glass saucer. Nearby a glass cabinet displayed a series of herbal concoctions especially prepared by the Akanidi herself. At last, after what seemed ages to Charles, the Akanidi, Adobia Acrifi, lifted her head and smiled confidently at him as she replaced the report in its plastic folder, pushed it aside and sat up straight, ready for business. "Okay, Charles, let us now discuss the contents of this report openly and honestly. If the report is correct, then we have no problems with the subject's personality, except for 3 minutes on Sundays. The problem, I believe, is therefore not with the personality, but with you and your attitudes to and reverence for science. You have been looking for symptoms, theories, and case study solutions. That is a totally scientific or modern clinical approach, a cure with surgical precision. Such methods have, of course, proved on occasion to be true and excellent, but will not do so in this case. Had you not known me personally, I doubt that you would have consulted the Akanidi for advice and help. Your approach has been the way of the flesh, which all too often is limited to the 5 common senses. I also believe in the power of scientific knowledge, but only up to this point. Science is empirical by nature, it is always based upon experimentation and its visible and logical results. It is in this way that science can be too objective because it dismisses as insignificant anything that it cannot understand or explain. Science is overanalytical and often wastes time by dissecting everything into its component parts in order to explain and understand truths which are beyond its reach. In certain cases, it is the whole, not the part, which has to be understood first. Science concerns itself methodically with causality, saying that for every cause there must obviously be an effect. I can admire and applaud this way of thinking, but unfortunately this field does not allow the possibility of an actuality which may be colorless, soundless, and formless. To scientists, such things exist only in the minds of men. The relatively commonplace qualities, and I believe realities, such as telepathy, clairvoyance, and distance or contact healing, are not accepted because they cannot be explained by logic or proven theories. Science is sometimes blind, Charles, and ignores the obvious. In ophthalmology classes, we are told that on a clear day on a plane, a man can see 20 miles away, but you and I can see a big ball of fire hanging out in the sky many thousands of miles away. Your problem has been, Charles, that you look at things from the wrong angle. Mary's 3-minute malady is a part of eternity, and, with the snail's pace you and science are taking, Mary is going to die. Charles just slackened. The Archimedes continued, what your conscience has been struggling to accept, despite all that you have been taught in medicine, is that Mary's cure cannot be found within the realms of psychiatry. The cure is native, the gods must be totally pacified, made to relieve and release Mary, to find a willing substitute, that and that alone. Let me tell you this, Charles. The Archimedes leant forward and gazed at Charles intently. Then, placing her trust in him completely, she began to confide in him. About 5 years ago, when the chiefs and elders informed me that the duty to serve the gods had fallen upon me, I did not take it lightly. I told myself that I would investigate my duties and responsibilities thoroughly, rigorously throw away the rubbish and polish the gold. I approached the task with an open mind and singularity of purpose. I did, however, believe that the knowledge and traditional beliefs our illiterate elders had clung onto for so long must be worthy of respect, and that, if possible, a marriage between such customs and scientific practice would be to some advantage. Such a partnership has always been my policy, Charles. I have attempted to take the best things from both methods and to discard the worst. I have turned my mud hut with its thatched and leaking roof into a small concrete palace, and I do not sit upon the floor if I have to divinate. I do not drink from a calabash. At the same time, I do use eggs, the blood of slaughtered animals, the oil from snakes, and other such cures when the need arises, while my nurses may give modern injections, tablets, and so on. I believe in the Christian God, yet I also worship my ancestral gods. The Archimedes took out her small pocket diary from a drawer in her desk and, turning the pages to a particular date, wrote in it. Then, glancing up at Charles, she told him, see me at midnight with Mary 2 Saturdays from now. Charles' face betrayed his dismay. Can it not be sooner? He asked, disappointed at her apparent lack of urgency. Mary has to be well before that. She has the assignment of her life 2 weeks on Sunday when she must deliver a speech at her school. Can't you do something before that? In nature there is no time and there are no emotions. At that level of purity all is well. Accept what will be and trust me. Greet Mary for me and come with her on the day I have assigned to her. After arranging an appointment for the following Sunday when they would discuss in detail the manner of Mary's deliverance, they entered into trivial talk of university days and the good times they had had together in the past. It was some time after 2 in the morning when Charles said good night to Adobia, put life into the Datsun 260C and was on his way back to Accra, feeling happier than he had